Today I will tell a story that started with love but ended in betrayal. It will show how love can break a heart into pieces. Listen carefully. It can happen to anyone. Let's go. I always considered myself a happy person. I had a good job, a decent salary, prospects for growth, and most importantly, a girl I loved with all my soul. Her name was Emily. She was the center of my universe, the one for whom I woke up in the morning and who made my life meaningful. With her, I could be myself, and as I thought at the time, she felt the same way. We met almost 2 years ago at one of my company's corporate parties. It was an evening full of laughter and lightness. I didn't expect to meet someone who would change my life. But there she stood in front of me, with a slight smile on her lips and a sparkle in her eyes that was mesmerizing. Her long brown hair shimmered in the light of the lamps, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. We quickly found common ground, and then our interactions evolved into a relationship that I thought was perfect. Emily was ambitious and determined. She always knew what she wanted out of life and was willing to pursue her goals at any cost. I admired that about her. I felt that traits like that made her special, made her stand out from others. She always supported me in my endeavors, pushed me to do better, motivated me to strive higher, but I also felt that I had someone around me who could be trusted unconditionally. Our relationship seemed strong. We made plans for the future. We discussed buying a house, traveling, maybe even children. It looked as if all roads were open to us, and together we could achieve everything we dreamed of. With Emily, I felt strong, capable of anything. She was the person who gave me the strength to move forward, no matter how difficult the path. Work was going well too. I had been working for a large technology company for a few years now, and I was confident that I was on the right path to success. My boss, Mr. Robertson, although strict, always gave me the opportunity to grow. I did not seek a friendly relationship with him, but respected him for his professionalism and foresight. He was a man of great experience and weight in the company, and I was proud to learn from him. Over the past few months, however, I began to notice that Emily was becoming increasingly interested in my work. She began to ask about my projects more often, to inquire about internal company affairs, and, surprisingly, to show up more often at corporate events where she had previously been less enthusiastic. In the beginning, I was even glad to see her interest. It seemed to me that this was a good sign. She was interested in my life, wanted to be closer. But soon I began to notice something strange. Emily began to talk too often with my boss, Mr. Robertson. At first, it was short conversations at parties that didn't attract much attention. But then their meetings became more and more frequent, and the conversations lengthened. I tried not to pay much attention to it. After all, Mr. Robertson was married, had 2 grown children, and was much older than Emily. I convinced myself that it was just a job, nothing more. However, the alarm bells were becoming more and more prominent. Emily started staying in meetings after I had already left, and sometimes even spending time with Robertson outside of office events. She justified this by saying that she was discussing career opportunities with him and wanted to figure out how to be more successful in her professional life. I tried to believe her, since she was always honest with me, but something inside told me it wasn't that simple. One evening, when Emily came home later than usual, I couldn't stand it and decided to ask her a direct question. "You've been hanging out with Robertson more and more. What's going on between you two?" She looked at me with surprise, but without a shadow of guilt or embarrassment. Her face remained calm, as if she had been waiting for this conversation. "Eric," she began, "you know I'm always striving for more. I'm talking to Mr. Robertson because he can help me in my career. He has connections, experience, and he sees potential in me." Emily's words sounded logical, but something in her tone made me wary. She sounded like there was more than just a professional relationship between them. I didn't want to seem paranoid, however. I convinced myself again that it was just my fears and insecurities playing tricks on me. A few weeks passed, and the situation was getting more and more tense. Emily started spending more time at work, came home late, and had little interest in our mutual plans. I tried to talk to her, but each time she would go off topic, pretending nothing was going on. There was no longer the sincerity and warmth in her eyes that I was used to seeing. I could feel her slipping away from me, but I couldn't do anything about it. The feeling of helplessness was eating me up inside. I didn't understand what had gone wrong. We were such a strong couple, making plans, dreaming of the future, and now I watched her drift away, showing no interest in what was happening to me. Every night, returning to the empty apartment, I asked myself the same question. What had I done wrong? Why did everything I had built suddenly start to crumble? Every morning, I woke up with a growing sense of unease. I couldn't shake the thought that something had gone wrong. Emily had become distant. I noticed it in little things. Her glances, the careless touches that had once been warm and affectionate, now seemed casual, as if she were doing them out of habit rather than desire. The morning was another confirmation of this. We used to always make breakfast together, laughing, discussing plans for the day. And now, I was often alone, with a cold cup of coffee and an empty plate because she had long since left the house, it seemed to me, for work. But today was different. I woke up before she was about to leave. Tension hung in the air, and it was almost palpable when I noticed her hurrying. Emily was packing quickly, like she was avoiding some inevitable conversation. I wanted to say something, to stop her and find out right here, right now. But I stayed silent. The fear of hearing the truth was stronger than the desire to figure it out. All day I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept returning to Emily and our fading communication. Over the past few months, we had gone from being two close people to almost strangers. Every time I wondered what could have gone wrong, images of my boss, Mr. Robertson, and her frequent visits to his office came to mind. They were always discussing some business matters, as she explained it, but something about their interactions seemed too personal to me. I didn't want to think the worst, but those thoughts haunted me. The more time passed, the harder it became to ignore the truth. Emily spent more and more time in Robertson's office. Sometimes I'd find her sitting with him behind closed office doors when I went out for a break. Their conversations would go on for hours. I told myself it was just work, but deep down I knew I couldn't be fooled anymore. My jealousy was becoming unbearable, and I didn't know how to deal with it anymore. One night when Emily came home, I couldn't take it anymore. Everything inside me demanded answers. I knew the silence would destroy me from the inside out if I didn't hear the truth right now. Emily walked into the apartment as if she wasn't expecting to see me. She took off her coat and threw it on the chair without paying much attention to me. It was clear to me that I no longer existed for her in the way I had before. "Emily, we have to talk," I said with desperate determination in my voice. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I tried to keep my voice calm. She stopped, looking at me as if she was ready for this conversation. "Eric," her voice sounded too calm, almost indifferent. "What do you want to talk about?" Her indifference hit me harder than if she'd started yelling or making excuses. That cold calmness, I felt like that was the whole point. Emily had made some kind of decision long ago, and she was more concerned now with how I was going to take it. "Do you notice that something has changed between us the last few months?" I asked, struggling to find the words. "You've grown distant. I don't recognize you. You don't come home on time. You're spending more and more time with Robertson. What's going on?" Emily rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed, as if this conversation was a waste of time. "Eric, you're the one who's misunderstanding everything. You've changed. You're so focused on your work that you've stopped paying attention to me. What's so surprising that I'm looking for someone who actually listens to me?" The words sounded like a punch to the gut. I hadn't expected such an accusation. Yes, I was busy at work, but I always made time for her. But her cold, accusing tone said that she already had an excuse for everything I could charge her with. "I understand," I said slowly, trying to keep my cool. "But why Robertson? Why are you spending so much time with him? I've seen you two together. It's not like work meetings anymore." She looked at me with a kind of strange satisfaction, as if I'd finally said something she'd been waiting for. There was no regret in her eyes, just cold determination. "Because Eric, he understands me. He and I share the same interests, the same goals. He supports me, sees potential in me. Have you ever felt that way about me?" Her voice became hard, almost defiant. "Supportive?" I could feel my anger rising. "Emily, don't you see what you're doing? You're cheating on me with him, aren't you? There was a pause. She didn't avert her eyes, didn't try to walk away or pretend to be shocked by my question. Instead, she took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for something inevitable. Yes, she finally said, her voice cold and indifferent, like her behavior over the past few months. I'm sleeping with him. The words literally tore me apart. Time seemed to stop. I stood in front of her, unable to move. My mind was filled with fragmentary thoughts, but none of them could form meaningful words. My heart, which a few moments ago had been beating furiously, now seemed to stop. Why? I squeezed out, feeling the lump in my throat. Why did you do it? Emily looked at me without a shred of regret. She didn't seem to care at all how I felt, that it was destroying me from the inside out. She was no longer the woman I loved. It was someone else. Because he can give me what you could never have, she replied without blinking an eye. Money, influence, a career, all the things you could never offer. Those words stabbed me in the back. I'd always tried, done everything I could to give her and me a bright future, but it wasn't enough for her. She was interested in something else, not feelings, not love, but success and money. All the things I thought were unimportant to our relationship came first in her eyes. How long had this been going on? I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. A few months. Her tone didn't change. It started when I realized that you were fixated on your work and forgot about me. I couldn't hold back any longer. My body was shaking with anger and frustration. Everything I thought was important was now shattered. Emily hadn't just cheated on me, she'd betrayed me for something I'd never considered valuable in our relationship. I felt the world collapse around me. Emily, seeing my state of mind, said quietly, I'm leaving, Eric. It's best for both of us. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the room all alone. My heart was breaking and my mind refused to believe what had just happened. I stood in an empty apartment, surrounded by silence. She was gone. Just gone without turning around, without a word of goodbye. The click of the door was the final point that separated my old life from my new one, where there was no more room for Emily. My heart was torn apart. I didn't know what to do, how to move on. There were 1,000 questions swirling around in my head, but there were no answers. I sat down on the couch and covered my face with my hands. My fingers were shaking, as if they couldn't take all the pain that was overwhelming me. All those years I'd spent with Emily flew before my eyes like images from an old movie. I remembered our first kiss, the way she'd laughed when we'd cooked dinner together, and the way she'd cuddled me before bed. It all seemed so distant and unreal now, as if it were happening to someone else, not to me. It seemed as if that world had disappeared, leaving only ruins. I felt devastated. The silence in the apartment was deafening. There used to be so much life here, laughter, conversation, music. But now the place was a stranger. Every single thing reminded her of her. Her favorite cups stood in the kitchen, her clothes hung in the closet. A book she never finished lay on the bedside table. I couldn't shake her presence, even when she wasn't here anymore. It was like a haunting and invisible ghost that continued to exist around me despite her physical absence. For hours, I just sat on the couch, unable to move. Time lost all meaning. I don't remember how the night passed. Perhaps I fell asleep from exhaustion, but when I opened my eyes in the morning, nothing had changed. The pain hadn't gone away. It had only gotten sharper. It seemed to be embedded in every cell of my body, in every corner of my mind. I stood up, but I didn't know what to do next. My life was shattered, and I had no idea how to put it back together again. All of my plans, all of my dreams were tied to Emily, but now they no longer existed. What was left for me? A job? But even that was poisoned by her betrayal. Every time I thought of the chief, I remembered her saying she was sleeping with him. Those words were like poison that continued to eat away at me from the inside out. I decided I couldn't stay at home. These walls were too saturated with memories of her. I got dressed, even though I didn't know where I was going or why. I went outside, hoping the fresh air would help me regain my senses, but it was no use. Everything around me seemed as alien as my own apartment. People passed by, minding their own business, and I suddenly realized that my world was shattered, while theirs went on as if nothing had happened. I was alone with my pain. I had nowhere to go, but my feet led me to the nearest cafe where Emily and I used to frequent. I didn't think about it, just sat down at a table by the window, as if that might bring back a piece of the past. But of course it didn't. The waitress brought me coffee, and I stared thoughtfully at the cup, feeling the emptiness engulf me more and more. Ever since she'd left, I hadn't known what to do with myself. I couldn't even make sense of my feelings. The pain of betrayal, the anger, the frustration. It all mixed into one unbearable cocktail that I didn't know how to drink all the way down. I couldn't get rid of the image of Emily standing in front of me the moment she confessed to cheating. Her cold, impassive voice, her indifference. How could she so easily tell me she was sleeping with another man and then immediately walk away, leaving me with nothing but that brutal truth? I felt helpless. I felt like I had nothing more to lose, but that didn't make it any easier. The questions kept coming. Why? And how did I not see it before? Maybe I was blind to her desires and ambitions. Maybe I was really too focused on myself and my work. But even if that was the case, did that justify her betrayal? A few days passed. I stopped counting time. Life lost all meaning, and I just drifted along. I stopped working. I couldn't look my boss in the eye, knowing that he had taken away not only my girlfriend, but also the future I was building with her. I tried to run away from my thoughts, filling my days with random chores, but it was all pointless. Everywhere I went, Emily continued to haunt me. I thought about her words, the way she justified her cheating with her career and money, and it drove me crazy. One night when I couldn't sleep again, I realized I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't just sit around and wait for the pain to go away. It wasn't something that could just be endured. I needed to take action, even though I didn't know exactly what to do. But to stay in this state was to ruin myself completely. I decided that I needed to face the truth face to face. I could no longer run away from what had happened. The next day, I pulled myself together and went to the office. It was the hardest decision I had made in weeks. Everything inside was resisting. I didn't want to see Emily or Robertson, but I knew that if I didn't do it now, I would never find peace. When I got to the office, I immediately felt the stares of my coworkers on me. Everyone knew that something had happened between Emily and me, but no one dared to ask. Office rumors always spread quickly, and now I was their main topic. I tried to ignore it. I needed to focus on what was important. Robertson was in his office when I walked up to his door. My heart was pounding frantically in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew I had to do it. I knocked and walked in without waiting for an invitation. The chief looked at me with a slight smile that disappeared as soon as he noticed the look on my face. "Eric," he began, but I interrupted him. "We need to talk." He stopped talking, clearly realizing that this was going to be a serious conversation. "You stole everything from me," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "You took Emily from me, my life, everything I'd built. How can you keep working here and act like nothing happened?" His face remained calm. He listened to me without saying a word. My body was shaking with anger, and I wanted him to justify himself somehow, to say something that would explain his actions. But he didn't. "Eric," he finally said with a heavy sigh, "you have to understand that these things happen. We can't control what we feel." The words made me even angrier. It seemed like he was trying to make it all seem normal, like what he did was just life. I silently walked out of the office, feeling the rage still bubbling up inside me. It gave me no peace, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here any longer. I walked out of the office and felt the weight of the world weighing down on me even more. Talking to the chief brought no relief or answer. His words seemed to glide across the surface of my mind without resonating inside. He talked about emotions and uncontrollable feelings, but it sounded like an excuse to cover his lowliness, as if you could just dismiss the consequences of your actions with such banal words. The office corridor seemed longer than usual. Every step echoed in the empty space, as if the whole world had suddenly died out. I couldn't feel my body, as if I were outside myself, looking at my own life from the outside. My head was buzzing. One thought was chasing another, but I couldn't focus on any of them. I wanted to scream, to drop everything, to disappear, but that didn't bring relief either. Colleagues passing by looked at me as if I were a ghost. Perhaps I was something of a shadow to them, someone they were used to seeing in a different role, and now they didn't know what to do with what was left. I saw a mixture of curiosity and pity in their eyes. They knew what had happened, of course they did. But no one came up, no one asked, no one offered to help. Maybe they were afraid of being pulled into the maelstrom, or maybe they didn't care. I was alone. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. Instead of returning to my workplace, I turned around and walked away. I left everything. I didn't want to stay where every corner of the office reminded me of what had happened, of what everyone knew, and no one did anything about. I don't know how I found the strength to leave the building. My legs wouldn't listen, like I was a robot following a programmed command. Just step by step until I was on the street. The city met me with the hum of cars and crowds of people going about their business. I stood in the midst of this stream, not knowing where to head. Every day there were hundreds, if not thousands of people with their own lives, their own worries, their own problems. I was just a small grain of sand in this huge mechanism. None of these passers-by knew that at this very moment my life was falling apart. To them, I was one of many whose pain didn't matter. I wandered the streets without purpose. I passed familiar places, the coffee shops, bars, parks where Emily and I had once spent time. These places seemed foreign now. They no longer belonged to me. They belonged to memories that reminded me time after time of what I'd lost. I couldn't go back there, couldn't feel that pain again. For the first few hours, I just tried to run away from those thoughts, those memories. But the longer I walked, the more I realized there was no way to do that. I carried this pain inside me, and wherever I went, it would follow me. I could quit my job. I could avoid places associated with Emily, but I couldn't get away from myself. I stopped at some old bar I'd never noticed before. It looked shabby, but right now I didn't care as long as I wasn't on the street. I walked inside and sat down at the counter. The bartender looked at me, obviously noticing my condition, but didn't say anything. He just poured me a beer and set the glass in front of me. "Thank you," I said, though the words seemed empty and unnecessary. I took the first sip, trying to dull the pain with alcohol, but even that didn't help. The taste of the beer was bitter, as were my thoughts. I sat staring into the glass as life went on around me. There were several people at the bar, each of them busy doing something different. Some were laughing, some were discussing the latest news, but no one was paying attention to me. I was just a part of the interior. The hours passed and I stayed in the same position, pondering how things had gotten this far. What had I done wrong? When had our life with Emily started to come apart at the seams? I tried to remember some moment when things changed, but I couldn't. Maybe it happened gradually and I just didn't notice. Maybe I was too focused on my work, on my business, and didn't see her drifting away from me. But even if that was true, how did that justify her betrayal? With each new sip, my thoughts became more and more confused. My mind replayed over and over again the day she confessed to cheating on me. Her cold voice, her indifference. How could she ruin everything we had so easily? How could she prefer the chief, a man who was just using her for his own ends? I finished my beer and felt slightly dizzy. It seemed the alcohol was finally starting to take effect, dulling the pain a little. But it was only temporary relief. I knew that when I left the bar, everything would go back to normal. All those feelings, thoughts, images of Emily and Robertson would be waiting for me outside. "More?" the bartender asked, noticing that I'd finished my glass. "Yes," I answered shortly, not even thinking about it. I didn't want to go back to reality, didn't want to feel that pain again. He poured another glass, and I took a sip, feeling the alcohol slowly spill through my veins. It seemed to be the only thing that could help me right now. I knew it wasn't the answer, but I didn't care. At that moment, I was willing to do anything to avoid feeling this frustration and emptiness. As I finished my second glass, the world around me became a little foggy. The bartender looked at me with slight concern, but said nothing. He'd probably seen people like me hundreds of times, people trying to numb their pain with alcohol. I was just another broken-hearted customer to him. At some point, I realized I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't live my life hiding behind a wall of alcohol. I couldn't keep running away from my thoughts. I needed to find a way to move on, no matter how hard it was. I couldn't let Emily and Robertson ruin me completely. By the time I left the bar, night had already fallen on the city. The streets were empty, but the cold wind was still a reminder that the world around me continued to exist despite my pain. I pulled up the collar of my coat and headed home, feeling reality return step by step. Returning home brought no relief. The apartment greeted me with a silence that made me want to scream. Emily's scent still lingered in it. Her things were still here, but they felt foreign to me now. I couldn't be here surrounded by things that reminded me of our life that was over. I started packing her things into boxes, not even thinking about what I was going to do with them. I just threw everything. Clothes, books, her favorite mug. It was an act of desperation, an attempt to get rid of anything that reminded me of her. I wanted to cleanse my space, as if that could help cleanse my soul as well. When I was done, the apartment felt even emptier. But at the same time, I felt some kind of relief, as if I had taken the first step toward liberation. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't live in the past anymore. Emily was gone, and I had to learn to live without her. When I woke up the next day, everything seemed a little foggy. The headache was making itself felt, the effects of last night at the bar. The alcohol had dulled the pain for a while, but in the quiet of the morning, everything was back to normal. I was alone with reality again. Emily was gone. The chief went on with his life as if nothing had happened. And me? I didn't know how to move on anymore. Picking up my phone, I saw several missed calls from work. At first, I didn't pay attention, probably just routine work issues that could wait. But a sense of unease began to ripen inside. Something wasn't right. I opened Messenger to check the messages and immediately came across the name of my boss, Robertson. His message was short and unexpected. "Eric, we need to talk. Come to the office by 9. I froze. Everything inside clenched. This didn't bode well. Robertson and I hadn't spoken since that confrontation in his office. I wasn't sure I was ready to meet with him again, much less discuss anything professionally. I thought about ignoring his message, just not showing up. But that wouldn't solve the problem. Sooner or later, I would have to face reality. And maybe this was that moment. I got dressed and walked out of the house. The cold morning air brought me back to my senses a little, but the thought of the upcoming conversation kept me on my toes. What if he decided to fire me? What if he didn't want me in his company anymore? In a way, I was already prepared for that eventuality. After he took Emily away from me, taking my job seemed like the logical next step. When I entered the office, the atmosphere was strange. Colleagues were working at their computers as usual, but I could feel their eyes periodically directed at me. They knew. I wasn't sure exactly what they were talking about, but office rumors usually spread quickly. Shortly after I passed through the open area, one of my work friends, Tom, came up to me and quietly asked, "Eric, did you hear the news?" "What are you talking about?" I asked, not realizing what he meant. Tom looked worried and spoke as if he didn't want anyone else to hear our conversation. "I'm not sure, but they say you've been called to the chief for something serious. Something about your behavior lately." His words came out of the blue. My head was spinning. I hadn't expected my behavior in recent weeks to be the subject of discussion. Sure, I wasn't at my best, but I thought I'd managed to keep up a semblance of normalcy. I nodded to Tom, trying not to give away my excitement, and headed toward Robertson's office. On the way, I kept thinking about what he might have against me. When I reached his door, my whole body tensed. I knocked and a voice from inside invited me in. Robertson sat behind his large wooden desk, confident and calm as always. His gaze was shrewd, as if he had already made some important decision. "Eric, sit down," he said, pointing to the chair in front of him. I sat down, trying not to betray my excitement, though I was trembling inside. It seemed that this moment would decide my fate. "I've been thinking about how best to start this conversation," Robertson began, folding his hands on the table in front of him. You probably realize that your work has left a lot to be desired lately. His words cut to the heartstrings, though I'd expected something like that. I nodded, unable to object. I understand that you've had personal difficulties, he continued, as if with a touch of sympathy, though I knew what was behind it. But the problem is that your difficulties have begun to affect your work. You don't submit reports on time, you delay projects, and I get complaints from my coworkers. I clenched my fists, but I didn't say anything. I was seething with rage, but I knew that any word at this point would only make things worse. Eric, Robertson continued, looking me straight in the eye. I've been thinking about this for a long time, but I've come to the conclusion that we have to part ways. The company can't afford to keep an employee who can't do his job. The word break up hit me like a hammer. I couldn't believe my ears. I was being fired. Everything I had built over the years was crumbling right before my eyes. And the most painful part was that this was coming from the man who had stolen not only my job, but my personal life as well. Are you serious? I barely spoke, feeling my voice trembling. It's not a decision I made lightly, Robertson replied, his voice flat and cold. But unfortunately, we have no other choice. We appreciate your services in the past, but it doesn't work now. Your last day is today. Those words sounded like a sentence. I sat in the chair, feeling the world crumble around me. Everything I had, my job and Emily, it was all gone. I had nothing anymore. I could feel the rage coming in waves, but I couldn't do anything about it. Robertson kept talking, but I couldn't hear his words anymore. Something inside me broke. You can get your stuff, and I'm sure HR will help you with the paperwork. His voice sounded distant, barely audible through the fog of my thoughts. I rose from my chair without looking at him. At that moment, I didn't care what he was saying. I just wanted to leave. I left the office without looking back, feeling tears of rage come to my eyes but not letting them come out. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. By the time I reached my desk, my coworkers already knew what had happened. A few people tried to strike up a conversation, but I didn't listen to them. I just started packing my things, not thinking about what was going to happen next. There was just emptiness in my head. At some point, Tom came up to me, trying to be supportive. Eric, I don't know what to say. This is all so sudden. His voice sounded sincere, but I didn't care. Don't worry, I replied quietly, keeping my eyes on the box I was putting my personal belongings in. When I was done, I took one last look around the office where I'd spent so many years. It all seemed like some kind of nightmare. Yesterday I'd lost Emily, and today I'd lost my job. I didn't belong here anymore. Everything I knew, everything I had been destroyed. I walked out of the office, feeling the emptiness growing inside of me. I was a nobody, no job, without a relationship, no future. The streets felt foreign to me, as if I was in this city for the first time. I stood with a box of my belongings in front of the office I'd spent the last few years of my life in and didn't know where to go. It was as if my path had been cut right in front of me. I had been stripped of everything. My job, my relationships, my meaning. Everything that used to keep me afloat was gone. A cold wind blew in my face, but I barely felt it. There was only emptiness inside. I had always thought that I could handle any difficulty, that I had a purpose that led me forward. But now it was all a lie. Yesterday I lost Emily, and today I lost my job. It was like the final nail in the coffin of my hopes and dreams. I walked down the street, not knowing where to go. My feet carried me forward, but my mind was not clear. I was like a ghost wandering through a deserted city, looking for something to bring me back to reality. However, not a single familiar corner gave me that feeling. Everything I saw reminded me of lost time, of something that would never come back. At one point, I stopped on a bridge and looked down at the muddy river slowly flowing below me. The water was calm and cold, just like my condition. A strange thought struck me. What if I just ended it all here and now? I stood looking at the river and suddenly realized that I had nothing to lose. My life was ruined. I no longer had Emily, no job, no future. What was left? Just emptiness. But something inside me wouldn't let me take that step. Maybe it was a last crumb of pride or an instinct for self-preservation, but I just couldn't go over the edge. I felt tears come to my eyes, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to let them out. I stood on the bridge and cried, feeling the pain I had been holding inside for so long finally burst out. After a few minutes, I felt the tears dry up, but with them went the feeling of hopelessness. It didn't feel any easier. Rather, I felt a strange clarity. I realized that I was standing on the wreckage of my old life. Everything I had built was gone, but perhaps it wasn't the end. I returned home. The apartment greeted me with the same cold emptiness, but now I looked at it differently. Instead of a place full of memories of the past, it became a symbol that I could start from scratch. I walked over to the boxes I had put Emily's things in and decided it was time to take a step forward. I started throwing out her things. One by one, books, clothes, trinkets, all went flying into the trash can. With each thing I threw away, I felt the weight off my soul become a little lighter. It was a cleansing ritual of sorts. I was getting rid of anything that reminded me of the life that was over. It was the first step to a new beginning. When I was done, the apartment was almost empty, but at the same time I felt a sense of relief. It was my space now, and there was no room in it for the past. I sat down on the couch and felt calm for the first time in a long time. Of course, my life was still far from perfect, but I no longer felt the hopelessness that had overwhelmed me on the bridge. The next day, I began to think about what to do next. I didn't have a job anymore, but that didn't mean I couldn't find a new one. I decided that I wasn't going to waste time regretting the past. Instead, I started updating my resume and looking at job openings. The job wasn't just a source of income, it was a way to regain control of my life. After a few days, I started getting responses from different companies. There were several interviews, and although some of them ended in failure, I didn't give up. Each new conversation gave me more confidence that I could recover. I realized it wasn't going to happen overnight, but I was willing to work on it step by step. At some point, I realized that I no longer thought about Robertson and Emily the way I used to. Sure, the memories of them were still painful, but they were no longer dominating my life. I was no longer the person who depended on their opinions and decisions. I was free. One evening, as I sat at my computer looking through another job posting, I received a text message from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in a while. We weren't particularly close, but we had once attended university together. He suggested we meet for dinner, and although I was hesitant at first, I eventually agreed. I realized that isolation was only exacerbating my condition, and I needed to come out of my cocoon. At the meeting, I realized how much I had changed over the past few months. We talked about old times, recalled mutual acquaintances, and I realized that it had been a long time since I had experienced the real joy of communication. My friend told me about his life and how he'd been through some tough times, and it inspired me. He too had faced betrayal, job loss, but was able to get through it and build something new. That conversation was a turning point for me. I realized that my situation was not unique. People go through similar crises every day, but it's not how many times you fall down that matters. It's how you get up. I no longer felt like a victim of circumstance. Instead, I started thinking about the future, about what I could do to change my life. It had been a few months since I lost my job and Emily. During that time, I found a new job at a small company where I felt more meaningful and valuable. I realized that I needed to get out of that old life to find myself anew. Robertson and Emily no longer had power over me. They were in the past, as were my old mistakes and misconceptions. I can't say I've fully recovered from all the blows that had befallen me, but I have learned to live with it. I've learned to move forward despite the pain and disappointment, and most importantly, I've learned that every crisis presents an opportunity for a fresh start. When I took one last look at the box of Emily's belongings, I realized that I no longer felt any pain or anger. I was ready to let go of the past and move forward. Life went on, and now I was ready for new challenges. My heart may have still carried scars, but those scars had become a part of me, a part of who I was now.